Hello everyone, today we introduce European feudal warfare. You know that this is a channel fundamentally dedicated to military history, but with a special bias for the Middle Ages, given that I'm a medievalist myself. And every once in a while, aside from the more in-depth videos, we try, at least like today, to make a generalizing introduction about what are we even talking about by everything is an approximation about this. That is, what is feudal? You could even ask what is European in this context, because mostly we will look at let's say the Frankish derived military culture in a sense, and what's properly the age, right, we're talking about. 10th to 12th century, others would say 11th to the 13th. I stick to the previous, at least for today, as an approximate. Even if some picture I've taken here in the video is from the 13th century, for example. But the what is feudal properly in nature of the vassalic beneficiary contract, let's say, and how does this evolve, and where's the beginning proper, what's the ending point? All these things are a bit irrelevant when we go to substantiate specifically what we'll talk about today in its entirety, in its complexity. Eventually we will make videos dedicated to the main chunks of feudal Europe in this regard, mainly England, France, the Empire, Spain, and others, looking specifically at more than the strictly military aspect in these generalizing videos, rather for the political and social background in a Clausewitzian sense, is to say why is that people fought this way. It's tricky sometimes to generalize, especially about these centuries, when you look also at what was happening in other areas of Europe, of the Mediterranean, etc., because the ways peoples fought altogether weren't dramatically different, right? Especially in Europe and the Mediterranean, more or less, right? You have certain trends, certain essential characters that, at least properly in the strata-like developing entities, are similar, unavoidably. We talk about certain fringes or frontier areas where instead a bit more of a tribal background was retained, and that is evident, right, in many areas in Europe, also because today we talk naturally about also the expansion of Frankish feudalism proper, with all it entailed, right, from the Norman conquests of England and of Sicily, the Spanish Reconquista, the Outremer states, even the Baltic Crusades, so and beyond. Right, so that's why it's difficult even to frame this clearly, and sometimes you can even generate some kind of malaise. That is, why don't I fit in a strictly Western line? This is a political construct. Well, in a sense, yes. At some point I would like to make a video to properly explain from one side, but also debunk what we all intend by Northern, Southern, Western, and Eastern Europe, which is naturally just an approximation that, in the way we conventionalize on, rather in one way rather than another, actually reflects more our political ideas than any kind of historical substance at the end of the day. But this in fact is for another time. Today we can start as early as fundamentally the collapse of Carolingian power. It's a process that, as you know, didn't also happen overnight, but it was particularly fragile, and especially it took place as a sort of implosion, right? Never think that the Carolingian Empire, as the Roman Empire or great empire, basically collapsed because there was some, guy from the outside that, make it crumble, right? They basically destroyed themselves by a certain degree. Of course, the others also profited of this, but it's basically impossible to distinguish the relation cause-effect when we talk even about the second invasions, for example, relatively to the Carolingian Empire. We're still looking at peoples that weren't as developed as the Franks themselves, and that in fact would end up being absorbed once again, even if the Carolingian Empire was no more, but this broader Frankish post-Carolingian reality that expanded basically everywhere, right, and absorbed the conquerors at some point. The Normans were, fundamentally Christianized and framed into a feudal Frankish-derived system. The same goes for even the Slavic frontier is somewhat overlooked by Hungary, with the Magyars that had launched the offensives. The Italians basically got the upper hand in the Mediterranean over the Saracens. The Reconquista also fundamentally is the concert of European joint affairs, just like the Crusades in the Near East. So there is an expansion fundamentally in all directions. Right, even with the Norman conquest of England, we have basically the same thing. So that is a big and macroscopic, especially set of dynamics that about which historians have started saying, but why did it happen in the first place? Today we don't even explain this. We already did it, tried to do it in part in other videos, Medieval Europe playlist. Also something in Historian as a general historiographical interpretation, because it can get that tricky in a sense. But some boundaries did exist, some substance did exist, some we can't categorize rigidly, but still there's a dynamic here that cannot be ignored. So at the death of Louis the Pious in 840, the Carolingian Empire fundamentally lost that original unity that had already been miraculous, considering the Frankish political institutional standards, right? Fundamentally the lack of a public culture, which is what fundamentally also feudalism fundamentally will embody in itself, but there was always some kind of public authority everywhere, not just there, but naturally also in other centers that contributed to boost it further, even in the Carolingian Empire. Let's say that after 840, the Carolingian Empire unity was never durably re-established in the following, essentially, half of a century that would eventually bring properly to the end of the Carolingian dynasty and power in male line. Right. However, the empire, this is another thing that we observed, especially in the Renovatio Imperii dedicated videos, maintained as that cult of public, religious, and military authority, right? Essence, in hypostasis, symbol, whatever, but also what had been factually, practical in with the same rise of of Carolingian power in Europe, maintained still a very envied prestige, right? And the kings that were preposed to the different chunks of the empire, after all, in this half century, were still Carolingians. So for a while, under the reign of Charles III, it seemed even that all the Carolingian legacy could come back stably in the hands of a single man. That was just an illusion, because Charles III had basically just outlived all of the other Carolingian male line. So basically, he just collected that binary. It's a bit how it happened, fortunately, for the Carolingian Empire to have existed in the first place, right? Because Charlemagne's brother died, because Louis the Pious also basically remained the only sibling on throne. So they had this strong dynastic, bias of imperial authority that is very characteristic, in fact, of medieval Europe. Also, and especially by Frankization, was very old. It dated back to Merovingian times. Carolingians, in many ways, were dramatically capable of, inheriting even the same Merovingian propaganda system to basically show themselves as the renovators, whereas they basically adopted largely all what was the Merovingian system. It wasn't that completely, useless and crippled and dysfunctional as they wanted to depict. In fact, imperial grandeur, of dynastic, of blood, of purity, of sanctity, right? Remember always, the Franks were the chosen people of God, right after the Jews and the Romans, that the Franks believed firmly in the fact that they were chosen people that would have had to conquer the world, and that was pretty much it, right? Also because the Franks were literally and exclusively and incontrovertibly about war, right? There was nothing else properly in the horizons of the Carolingian elite, right? The lady, the imperial power, one of the vassals, etc., was exclusively founded on war. That's the only thing that this whole system was created through war. It finished through war, and was developed in order to make war. And this is why also, feudal warfare is so influenced by this, because the Franks basically seeded all the premises to develop this professional elite that by the 10th century mostly is regarded by historians, but even here we could debate, but chiefly like properly as a military class of some kind of standard was recognized in this area that by that point, the Carolingian Empire didn't exist anymore. Yes, the Ottonians revived it, and as we eventually what we properly call as if it was a different empire, right? The Holy Roman Empire. It's not so. It was exactly the same thing. It's an anti. You see, if you are a Holy Roman Empire fan and you think that the Ottonians basically created something different from Charlemagne, you're basically just doing the same thing that the Byzantines were doing, against the Carolingians or the Ottonians. It's a legalistic principle that has nothing to do with the eminently religious and military base on which the Imperium, since archaic Rome, was conceived, and by all these peoples was shared in the same way at this point in Western Europe specifically. And it's actually a very powerful one. That is to say, if you are in charge, it's because God wanted it, made it work, right? Just claiming that you were, the one that descended in line, let's say by election, whatever legal practice as a Roman emperor, there is a kind of an almost ethnicistic or, in fact, legalistic point that doesn't look in the face of reality. That is that the Carolingians conquered freaking Europe from, literally from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from Bretagne to central Italy, and this is something that would fundamentally never be reachieved until Napoleonic times. Right, so whatever, it doesn't matter how, in a sense, fragile the bases were and how eventually it faded, etc. But still, this thing was a big one, and it influenced for for even can say the next millennium to come properly the political and social and military identity of Europe, in a sense. Right, we can't go as far as saying that this legacy ended in 1792 or 1918. Right, the Ancien regime was, in a sense, created in this context. But there's maybe too much teleologism in this view, but and we know well, in fact, that things might have gone differently also in the same France and same, the countries that were eventually more impacting from that point of view, but it's not so wrong conception in the creation of properly the feudal elite and what this meant for properly the balance of the European communities in this broader Western sense. Could go on, but I don't think it's necessary for this video at least. So at the end of the Carolingian Empire, however, there were new political conditions, right? Also, military activities in the European West assumed a different aspect. Carolingian Empire was based; its sap was expansion, right? In many ways, as many empires, right? In this following centuries of gestation, properly of the military feudal military class, we have. For a short while, at least in the most defining moment of the military elite, probably a defensive purpose, or at least something that looked at a much smaller scale, warfare on a local base by a certain degree than it had been before. So even here we can't talk about the second invasions altogether. We can't even get to the end of them, in the sense that that's where we see properly Europe starting to to emerge in a with a different nature. That is the one that especially has been discussed historically, to say how the hell, how did they make it, right? Because let's be honest, after all, Europe, aside from the south of the Mediterranean area, up to that point historically had been fundamentally a backwards area in the world, right? You know, there was like Central Europe, Northern Europe, hadn't been, and some, especially the North, wouldn't also up to the end of the Middle Ages have this dramatic level of development at all, right, compared to most of the Southwest. But still, the rate of growth that we assisted to the whole Middle Ages at this point is from this point onwards is something really unique, literally in the history of mankind. I don't know. I may be ignorant about certain, but I don't think properly that there is anything of this. Right, I'm sure this didn't happen in China. It didn't happen in India. It didn't happen in the Near East. It's a typically European phenomenon, right? And mostly also Western European, fundamentally in nature, by rate of growth, right? Especially of certain areas, it's really impressive, right? Throughout all the Middle Ages, Southwestern Europe remained more advanced, but if you look at the rates of growth of England or Germany, especially, you see that they were even superior to the one of Southwestern Europe. So much that, I don't know, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, you can fairly say that countries like, Gaul or Italy were basically, the most advanced, the more productive. Germany was definitely not. By 1500, you have Italy and Germany that are the most technologically advanced countries in Europe. And that's something you say, wow, right? This happened in 1,000 years. That definitely are not a few, right? But in other areas of the world, you don't find with those preconditions usually the same levels of development in a comparative sense. These are pre-industrial societies reflect on. That at the Battle of Lechfeld, 955, the Magyar threat was fundamentally distanced, definitively. The Norman, the Viking incursions were fundamentally fading, right, with the 11th century. The Saracen threats also, up to the 12th century, that were consistent, but eventually they faded even in there. The West basically stopped being in a defensive position. Actually, this is at the latest, especially in the Mediterranean, when you realize that this time second invasions weren't like, an atomic bomb falling into something causing a wasteland, etc. No. We talked especially a lot about the Saracens that are overlooked, not much in the, objectively they didn't do properly as much as for example, as the Vikings did. Also in strictly military organizational terms, it's debatable if you want, but they were mainly piercing central Mediterranean in this regard. Also in the Eastern Mediterranean it was different, but say also the Magyars sent these raids that crossed all over Europe. They ravaged Germany, they arrived up to Spain, in Italy, in France. So it was actually, also in there something very specific from a strategical point of view, that if you want to resemble what had been previously what happened with the Huns, with the Avars, always from the same basins. But as we were saying at the beginning of the video, at the end of the day, all these threats were curbed, and not only, they properly were, these peoples were tamed in a way or another, right? Think about properly, in fact, as we were talking about before, the Battle of Lechfeld, of course, Greece there, properly Hungary will be absorbed at large into the Western sphere, right? The Vikings properly didn't exist anymore because they started finding more robust realities than the ones that they had used to harass and infest, and they stopped. Simply, the Scandinavia came back fundamentally to be receiving rather than exporting in that regard, and building on a local base. The Saracens, I don't know, the Normans of Sicily even established essentially a client state of Tunisia. Tunisia was the most, where the Aghlabites had started mostly for their invasion of Sicily, of their incursions in Italy, in France, etc. So you see here properly something else. This is reflected at so many levels that we discussed in culture, in trade, even in technology. There is a bit of a Nordicistic bias when we look at the Middle Ages, as if, the Middle Ages were the dark age of, wasteland that, was so difficult and complicated, as if, in previous or even later times when it was so dramatically different. This is absolutely not true. It definitely reflects certain realities in the northernmost areas of Europe by a certain degree, but the most where the greatest wealth was concentrated, also the greatest demographic, the greatest developments. The Middle Ages is fundamentally the civilization of machinery, of thirst of knowledge, of books, of architecture, of engineering. The Middle Ages it's something incredible, civilizationally speaking. It has nothing to envy to the ancient world at all, and it is, let's say, it's mostly a matter of miscontextualization that brings to the idea of an absolute, misery or darkness of this era that, frankly, mostly reflects just the level of underschooling of the people that still talk about in these terms by 2021. And it's difficult to understand this magnitude until you properly and objectively look at it in detail as well as in general, right? The West began to expand its dominion far and wide. Poland was converted. Hungary was converted. The Scandinavian kingdoms were converted, right? This expansion is very, let's say, is less impacting than, I don't know, when we talk about the Crusades, for example, we can't see there, well, okay, there was a military invasion and some states were established, right? When we look at northeastern Europe, we see, the Baltic Crusades, but it tend, not to parallel them so much as, the near eastern ones, or even the Reconquista, that objectively, yes, were kind of more more important in scale, if anything, and in consequences. But what is remarkable in northeastern Europe is how much the Western model, Christianity, feudalism, a territorialization of power, an ecclesiastical administration, literacy, etc., spread by themselves, right? The worst struggles were mostly internal, but the process through which this expansion occurred was largely locally autonomous. The local elites pioneered this. They decided that that big step of civilization had to be taken, right? And there is no doubt in a linear view of the world that this brought to a dramatic development of the same countries, in spite of which, in last times there are certain neo-modernistic subcultures that, would like to look at a sort of primitivistic or tribalistic or ethnicistic background, some sort of great values. No, it was total shit, right? By moral standards, by material standards that just were underdeveloped realities, and there is nothing that you can do about that, unfortunately, to rehabilitate them, because we know that by academic standards that it's not the case, but not just in history. We know it in just looking at properly anthropologically, sociologically. We studied those peoples, right? Even if there is not much about them, but it's not because of the Christians that those people didn't have a literature. In fact, quite the contrary. Nor there was a worsening of the absolute levels of development at all. I don't know how such positions can still be defended in this time, but again, there is a lot of ignorance about history, and altogether, it's not just about knowing the Middle Ages, because most of those delusions come from those people that focus exclusively on the Middle Ages, and in order to reinvent it as they please. You have to be able to read the history of civilization in a diachronic perspective, otherwise there is no comparative mean. Like, you just fantasize that, in the Middle Ages, in pre-Christian or, tribal times, people lived better, were freer. You have no idea what you're talking about. Properly by quality of life, by actual, problems of just even how to gather resources, or why those peoples lived in that way in the first place, and how they immediately changed when they could, as soon as they could, because, that was a terrifying reality. Misreading or inventing at that point even, I don't know, the juridical culture of these peoples or whatever, it's not because a society is less regulated that it's freer. It has nothing to do with that. Actually, it's mafia fundamentally, right? And we know the pre-statal realities are fundamentally ruled by mobsters. It's just a matter of how powerful and resourceful these mobsters become to be able to evolve into something more rational and capable and intelligent. But there is nothing otherwise, virtues, moral or inspirational on communities that were based exclusively on the enslavement, raping, and extermination of their own people, right? Or other peoples when they began to do, something else. But civilization passes also through such things, right? Even when it's up, it's just like the Vikings. The Vikings fundamentally were about slavery. Right, the main deal of Viking prosperity was based on the export of Christian slaves, right? And this wealth unhinged what Scandinavian society was before into a more developed organizational system. It passed through it because we all come from it doesn't matter which culture you come from. Up to a few thousands of years ago, you were exclusive about what we just said, right? From somewhere. Somebody had to start, right? So then the Viking example is also in this regard. If you want, Vikings were anti-traditional by Scandinavian standards. They were doing something absolutely frightening and dangerous for Scandinavian culture that wanted to maintain fundamentally just a local status quo, the alleged freedom, but even in their, single clans basically could do whatever they wanted. And somebody became more powerful. Of course, that was a threat for them, but on the long run, this brought also more order, right? So that's how it passed through it, civilization as well. In this, we're talking also about Latin Christianity here. Today, we don't open a parenthesis for Constantinople, for the Roman Empire, in perspective, because it did witness a similar expansion, but not as much as even certain Islamic areas. Albeit, the golden age of Islam was over here, but still there were, prosper and powerful realities that, just like the Byzantines, were becoming, even though not in the same Western standards, but heavily, more feudalized, more privatized as cultures. Whereas, the Caliphate fundamentally and the Roman Empire even more stemmed from essentially from a statal reality, a bureaucracy, tax collection system, a permanent professional military, all of these things. Latin Christianity indeed won over Orthodoxy on the longer run, right? The latter was confined essentially to countries that didn't develop dramatically, maybe with the same exception of the Rus, but those were fundamentally destroyed by the Mongols, and they changed to something very different that just by Western standards up to even the 19th century weren't comparable. The same Constantinople was taken eventually in 1204 by the Westerners, and even in there, all sense of things have been written. Why or not, we discussed this too. Some level, it does reflect, however, a fragility of some kind, or at least there is nothing too deterministic even in here. But let's say that at that point it would have never been possible for the Byzantines to do the same to the West, right? And you say, well, thanks my eyes, the West were multiple countries, if there were, well, yeah, but that's exactly the point, that the unity of the Byzantine Empire is being read as which extended over different countries, if you want, as well, as being read in kind of a, this is where mostly the debate lays, and I'm not fully convinced myself, but there is some truth in it. Probably sclerotized the system, right? We know it from different indicators that definitely are more evident when you compare the two realities. Today we can't do it, but I did it in some other videos. The same goes with Islam, right? By a certain degree, that was, compared to Europe, was actually much more politically unstable, right? For reasons that are a bit mixed, are, you know, we could say moral and material. Like Islam is more distrustful towards earthly authority than Christianity, and instead strongly operated in favor of it. But it's properly the Near East and Middle East that were different realities in terms of movements of peoples, of environments, of, you know, surrounding polities that made the situation probably less profitable. In general, the same goes for Mediterranean. I mean, what are the demographic or economic resources of North Africa compared to the northern shores of the Mediterranean? There is, you know, we invented a bit the black view of the Saracens as this great, you know, in the 19th century racist theories as these polluters of peoples, you know, this great mark left on southern. There is no actual evidence of this, aside from the fact that many Saracens were actually also Christian. But this is another story. But, you know, properly, from a demographic point of view, there was no way to make a headway in Europe from North Africa, right? Simply because you have the desert deep inside it, some, you know, tens or very few hundreds of kilometers, and you don't have much of an hinterland to develop further. So they are simply different realities. We can't even never by you know, just environmentalistic explanations, but those are important as well, especially in a pre-industrial society context where all these systems were fundamentally based on agriculture and practically not much else, just certain specific communities, especially, I don't know, the Italian city-states where, yeah, they had this, you know, quite impressive demographic and economical. They were an exception, though, right? You know, as many people, for example, living in the city as much as in the surrounding countryside, right? It's strange. Also per capita wealth. But even in there, you don't find necessarily the same degree of, for example, territorial expansion. Like Florence by the 14th century was the richest city in the entire world, but it was not even a provincial scale power fully meant, right? So it's not everything. It's never because of a single factor, a single indicator, right? What we see, though, is that Latin Christianity fundamentally wins more peoples than Orthodox Christianity. Also, Islam withdraws in Spain with the process of the Reconquista that also was halted at some point, slowed down better at some point. So, not much because of Islamic resistance capability, but simply because, you know, the Iberian monarchies are starting to fight against each other. And that is also another important, which you don't have to underestimate the importance of this, you know, internal warfare, right? That's also why feudal Europe, yeah, Europeans fought against each other, they killed each other all the freaking time. But war is a dramatic catalyst of civilization in ways that sometimes we're not willing to recognize, right? In a broader civil sense, but it is actually the case, and war is being definitely reevaluated in this sense, not as a good thing, morally speaking, by itself, but simply something that is capable of boosting a dramatic, or is actually mirroring by itself a civil capability, right? That, in fact, as you know, I'm very involved. I specialize specifically in medieval warfare, and I studied this, you know, mostly early 14th century warfare, not only, but you understand that the countries that made more war, right, that literally had a higher degree of belligerence, were fundamentally the most advanced. And this is something reflected also by all the entire history of mankind. That is to say, it's a pure culturalist garbage to even dare to presume that civilizational development has to do with the decrease in destructive capability. Absolutely not. Right? It surely gives the capacity to understand better when to make war and not to make it, but when you study medieval warfare seriously, I mean really from the sources and from the studies by academic standards, and you realize what these people fought, right? It's nothing like the caricatural and chaotic anarchy of brutes that just wanted to kill each other with swords for taste for blood, like most of the Middle Ages have been depicted. There was a lucidly an iron logic behind any of these measures, and I don't see at a popular level today any effort to try even to make a serious speech about this. Today we can't, but we talked about this on Schwerpunkt more than once, right? Never think that we mostly think the Middle Ages through modern and contemporary mythology, right? The real history, the ones that professionals do, it has never especially properly been about such ideas. These come from movies, from people chat, not from what we scientifically know about how human beings do stuff, and specifically in this case. As we were saying before, also in the Mediterranean, with the annexation of Sicily, the foundation of the Latin states in the east, right, Islam suffered important blows, right? So very important, Sicily was the main grain producer in the Mediterranean, right? In the ancient world, it normally Europe imported grain from Africa, right? The Romans did from Tunisia, also from Sicily or Sardinia or whatever, but the main granaries, also for Constantinople, were Egypt, etc. In medieval times, by the 12th century, it's Europe that exports grain to Africa, to the Near East. And the Latin state, the Crusader states in the Near East, are properly the end route, let's say the end place of the main branches of the Silk Road, right? So conquering them was definitely a big prize. At the same time, if you look at Central Europe, there is an imposing military, economical, and demographic pressure. Beyond the Elbe River, a new Germany was formed, right? And it's even more remarkable considering, as we were saying before, what the German resources up to a few centuries before had been about, right? And still, instead, there was here a dramatic push, a dramatic expansion towards the east that literally redrew also properly the ethnic map of Europe, as German communities were spread up to the 19th to 20th century, basically very, very far. Sometimes they were just islets, etc. But if you look at Central Europe, the Danubian area, the Baltic, etc., as you know, that is a medieval legacy, fundamentally. Even here, we don't have to see anything progressive as this was done in the past necessarily. This pressure also equated to the fact, mostly not because the agricultural revolution, it's all a myth. There was no particular technological development at this point that made the thing. There was not, but most of what we see in the change of agricultural practice was just because, politics and society was more organized by itself. There's nothing qualitative. Even if you look at the crop rates, yes, there were some improvements, or also some, crises somewhere else in that, some variations that do not show a qualitative increase in agricultural productivity. Here we're talking properly about a massive demographic growth that brought people to literally have to emigrate because they didn't have locally the resources to be fed properly. Feudalism helped dramatically because all this movement was essentially coordinated by the elites, right? Never think also that the trade boom of the Middle Ages, etc., was just, as Pirenne believed, the little merchant that began heroically to move from city to city and make it happen, right? It was an eminently aristocratic investment into landed property in international trade, etc., that eventually developed also the great urban civilization of the Middle Ages. And they went in parallel for some time. And surely all this phenomenon is characterized by an impressive series of military victories that the Western warriors were, scoring against their surrounding enemies. And such expansion is ever more remarkable, considering that it took place, and this is the other great mind blower. Just apparently, then there is a logic in here. In a time of accentuated political fragmentation, because as we know, between the 10th and the 12th century, there were also, or at least rose in some cases, relatively unified great states. Right. Look, for example, at the English one, the Norman kingdom in southern Italy, or the Castilian kingdom. Right. But when we look at France or the Empire, that were incidentally also the areas that would become more advanced. Right. Especially France and Italy. Well, in spite of the survival of, if you want, previous political pictures, like with kingdoms, namely, we witness the multiplication of duchies, of marquisates, of counties, of baronies, or simple seigniories of all kinds. Right, there were political cells fundamentally that enjoyed a large or basically complete autonomy or quasi sovereignty on their assets. This was also sanctioned at some time. Think about the allodium, right? It couldn't properly be touched even by the king factually. Think about proper city-states that are being born without any permission in practice. In the what was the picture of the Holy Roman Empire, simply began to build states by themselves, subjugating other lords from literally not even a status of nobility. And the main picture in these centuries is characterized by ties between man and man, and of rights of homage and vassalage. This is the principal characteristic of the complex phenomenon that the historians have called with the name of feudalism. Right? Feudalism is a term that somebody doesn't like anymore because they say, it doesn't, it was all much more varied and fluid. Yeah, it was, right? There was nothing like the so-called feudal pyramid, or that sclerotic, hierarchical perfection. But for the sake, for didactical sake, like it's like Byzantine, where when we say feudal, you're talking about that kind of mess. Right, but paradoxically, this mess had a gluing capacity that, in fact, other civilizations in around the world wouldn't show in the same way, right? Because it wasn't just about the homage, the vassalage, and all these mostly private ties, right? We have, objectively, when studying feudal Europe, we have often overlooked still properly the resurgence of public authority, of a juridical culture, of literacy, of lay presence in all sectors of society, and importantly enough, also in history. Right, this is somewhat overlooked. Right, not all Europe was just the clergy that worked for the princes that wrote the chronicles that are unreliable and that we don't study because it's they're biased. Right, this is an extremely simplistic idea, as much as the feudal pyramid or whatever. And even in here, there are certain reasons why we believe, at least we were told in the past, that this is the main picture. But still, at a popular level, it's still, in fact, very common to find this misconception, because there have been, also positively by other regards, but certain countries that prevailed historiographically in the world that, fundamentally told their own side of the story. Maybe they didn't look at what was happening like a few hundred kilometers away, right? So they stereotyped and pictured an idea of Middle Ages that, doesn't belong maybe to even most of Europe at that point. And yes, Europe was quite diversified, right? But it's also true that the majority of wealth and development and of properly civilizational increase and laid in certain areas, right? And this cannot be disregarded, because literally most Europeans in the Middle Ages were those countries, right? Others were somewhat depopulated. They didn't have comparable levels of wealth. They played a relatively marginal role in all this, right? But still, today, and I would say especially from those standpoints, this is not quite accepted, right? Because the Middle Ages for many is like ideally the time you can project your identity fantasy, where there were the good old-fashioned ways, and I'm sorry, at the time there were properly realities that were advanced on every level, right? That's also another myth that part originated also from the Middle Ages, that normally the places were more versed into something. Normally it's because they were versed into much else, right? The process of state building comes with the world political, social, and military development altogether, right? There isn't the people that is better at war and the one is better at trade, the other is better at letters, right? It's where you have the greatest civilizational advancement, you have everything concentrated in there. And that's in fact another picture that is often not told, right? And that's why also studying military history helps a dramatic lot, because I personally made a 3.5 years research to demonstrate exactly that we missed a huge elephant in the room when we talk about something so basic, like literally, I don't know, 14th century, early 14th century European warfare. That is to say, have we properly pictured the main developments in the art of war correctly, proportion to various? Seemingly not, right? So too much hyper specialization brings to properly missing the scale, the perspective, and this is unfortunately what mostly happens in most activities, as I've seen in any kind of that they get interested in history broadly meant, right? It's mostly putting people together for business purpose to feed them the usual bullshit about Middle Ages, and not even trying to stimulate properly an historical culture, right? To write that we consistently don't have. It's rising, but properly some awareness is rising, I suspect. I think, even banally, something from YouTube, like probably people know much more about history today than they did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There is no doubt in this sense. But the important is also how you know these things, how you can properly put them in perspective. Knowing more history doesn't mean to know a better history, just like reading doesn't mean to studying, or and studying doesn't mean understanding necessarily. They are all three different phases overlapping at some point, but still they require specific extra work that unfortunately educationally we're not brought to undertake, right? It's normal. We can't all be historians, but we could at least get a better sense from also the historical community broadly meant. So I fit in itself. I'm not accusing certain categories rather than others. This happens at every level, right? It happens among historians, among archaeologists, among reenactors, among humanists. It's like the average is disappointing in every field, and we can't do much better, really. And recognizing is already a great step forward. The general, let's say, picture, however, of Europe at this point is surely the one of tens or hundreds of principalities of the most different dimensions that each of which became the center of an independent military system that entailed, besides the specific means of attack and defense, the right and the power to declare war, to prosecute it, to terminate it, right? And hence, the multiplication of wars, sieges, raids, devastations, that, that's hence where we got also the idea that the Middle Ages were somewhat more, even more violent than other ages in nature. Well, this is not really true either, right? It can be profitably contextualized. It is true that medieval societies were more militarized than they had been in some, especially under larger, great ecumenic empires, etc. This is true. And we should open a huge parenthesis, because that's probably a field of research historically has not been studied enough. That is, how militarized were certain realities, right? This is not a matter of a people's combativity, but properly what they were exposed to at some point. Why did certain mercenaries came from certain areas mostly, or why were certain countries more civil in nature? What was the what was behind that? Because at the end of the day, the more the countries develop militarily speaking, the more it can afford demilitarization of the people. Because the more professional it becomes, it's armed, right? And here there are very interesting dynamics that I had the luck at least to say at some point. Maybe I can upload here to make a beautiful video, but it's evident in some realities. I don't know. Let's pick the empire, like Germany. Germany, for some point, like for most low Middle Ages, was, for example, land of mercenaries. And quite good ones. Why is this? Right? Here we can't answer the question, but just ever think about this. Has Germany a border? Like, did Germany, like in the East especially, have a border? Like, was it stable? Were these frontiers actually, they were open? Right? The world situation was kind of more stable. It was less of a public culture. Princely Germany kind of reflects that, especially after the the collapse of the attempted centralization at the hand of the Hohenstaufen. Where do these Germans go to fight when the ministerialist class enters in crisis? They want to make a war. They go en masse to Italy, that has lots of money to hire them, and that needs them, and takes them. And why does Italy do this? Like, you see in parallel that Italians are becoming ever more gentrified. They make a lot of money. They're ever less interested in the militia. They let professionals do war. And in parallel, there is a state building process there. There is a seigneurial development, the construction of provincial states with a solid, territorial control. This thing, like between Italy and Germany, passed some of the single most important medieval civilizational dynamics, and France was something very different. Even in there, of course, it contributed massive, but it was a different reality, also a very composite one in itself. It took a while, as you know, to create France as we know it. France as we know it is basically, would be just Neustria, right? Originally, the old Frankish Neustria. The rest was literally another country, or other countries even. That process of state building, that was the most feudal in nature of all Europe, it speaks the story of a success. Damn, France, the struggle, it's one of the countries in the world that literally risked to be, to be at some point wiped out from the map in a certain sense, especially in medieval times. Or if not properly, but let's say to have lost properly the French unitary character that it would develop from the modern age onwards, right? They did it anyway. How? Well, there you have to study what the Capetians managed to put together, and you have to study naturally what the Merovingians had done first, the Carolingians, etc. But it's not obvious that a country like France exists, right? By the 10th century here, like the Kingdom of Burgundy, or even the Kingdom of Italy, and even the much less developed Eastern Frankish Kingdom were, much better, unitary realities than the Western Frankish Kingdom was. It was a freaking mess, right? Burgundy was aborted, basically, as a kingdom. The Italic kingdom remained, but it basically never had a king anymore. And the Eastern Frankish Kingdom also failed in centralization. The Western Frankish Kingdom emerges as the single most powerful kingdom in medieval history. So the question there is, how the hell did they do it? right? Feudalism has actually a lot to do with that. There are lots of also Spain is quite fast. It's not talking about England as well. England, for example, had a very, the Anglo-Saxon, especially politics and administration had an important, it's had very important, at least, as a legacy role in the Anglo-Norman kingdom. England structured itself in a much more unitary country than France, right? Even with another precocious creation of capital, of bureaucracy, of chancery, of a mystics of monarchy. Well, Castile was impressive. Castile was a bit more similar like France. It was a true feudal state, right? Much more powerful and successful than Aragon by certain standard, at least, in territorial unity and especially in institutional unity, right? Also in Portugal it was created in a bit of less obvious way too. But let's say that every country has its history, and it starts from a negotiation of these public and private cultures that brought to something that we can't speak of literally as rights, as not an autocratic, simply divinely mediated power that imposes itself. No, it was always a negotiation. It was always the idea that we have to find an agreement. That's a very advanced civil accomplishment historically. Accomplished many factors. In Europe we had a Thucydides, a Xenophon. We had a logical, rational, critical thinking. Asia didn't. We inherited this. We did something which, at that point, objectively, even in the systematization of knowledge, etc., would never properly been done. The same scholastics, an important shift from Neoplatonism to Aristotelianism. That is not a few. That is essentially rejecting aesthetics and adopting, rationale as the base of a religious civilization. Unity. Let's not even talk about the role of the papacy here. In terms of juridical development of bureaucracy, the Angevin papal legacy is something incredible between 13th and 14th century. Let's not talk about the revival of Roman law by the Bolognese school sponsored by the Holy Roman Emperor. We're talking essentially of struggles, yes, but these struggles were reinforcing the local realities. Accomplished also, geography. Europe doesn't have a major river valley that, once you occupy, it's fundamentally you control the whole continent. We have mountains that separate one from each other. We have different basins. We have, peninsulas. We have islands. It's a very complex reality. You can't really control it all. Nobody actually ever did. This does a lot, right? We are open to the sea, but also to important continents, their resources. There is so much about this history that truly brought together in this uniqueness, right? It's never a single factor, but every of these probably were necessary to have what we identify today as Western proper. War surely played an enormous role, right? Analysts, chroniclers wrote continuously of these events because they were important to them. So it's sometimes they would be, it's so normal to them that to us it's not anymore, because we can't conceive, fortunately, like a lifetime spent in conditions where war was always the next thing to do by necessity, right? Understanding that why that was necessary or why it was normal is a good way to start and properly looking at this through another view, because it was not even a matter of option, right? It was not, everybody was peaceful, then one started to fight and brought together. Well, no, these were still so unstable systems that everybody profited them. Imagine even in our own society, if there wasn't a state, imagine it like, think about the ferocious political struggle that exists in our countries. Imagine that our countries weren't like unitary nation states, hyper centralized within a hyper powerful state like all in the West. It doesn't matter civil law, common law. It's factually, statal control today is something radically ultra hyper developed by any historical standard that ever existed in the past. Imagine that there wasn't such central control, but that every community was fundamentally still believing, in the US, Republican and Democrats, etc. But not every state, but properly every country or whatever, every major city was a state on its own. You can imagine how this struggle for control at that point would become to unify, because the need is always civilizationally to bring, in fact, to the states that we have created right now, to manage effectively life, and that's why we live in a better moment, and why before it wasn't better. But imagine the degree of permeability and exploitability and instability of these political systems. It's obvious that if somebody feels like it's like think about electoral competitions as well. There are certain states, certain areas that are become crucial altogether because they bring together that enough that is needed to be elected, and therefore there is an intense campaign there. Just imagine in the Middle Ages that became the next battlefield where you have to enforce that thing to happen, but and how it changes constantly. How it's beautiful to study military history because it makes you see properly how physically, locally, geographically something came to happen exactly in there, right? Which is not banal, it's not obvious. It tells you a big deal about the fluidity of politics, right? It obviously throws the concept of geopolitics completely out of the window because you understand that it constantly floated on something that had nearly basically nothing to do with geography in itself. And you would be surprised, in fact, also by the mobility of humans. Probably the mobility of human beings is the single most overlooked aspect in the entire human history. Right, for the myth that in the Middle Ages people didn't know, they got news in months and years. Nobody. This is a complete myth. People that controlled Europe could easily know everything in a few weeks. You would say that the average peasant wasn't much interested, aside from the local wars or where the major ones invested in. They didn't have they didn't have capacities to prevent that, so hence they didn't care. Also, they weren't literate. Yeah, that is true. But in terms of who held the system, everybody knew everything, literally. Like, you study any chronicle, study anything that happened in here, everything was so dramatically intertwined at all levels. What do you think that in the 12th century, literally what a single nobleman did in the Kingdom of Jerusalem reflected entirely what happened in the Kingdom of Germany in the elections, of what Turks did, what the Italians did, what the Byzantines did, what the French did. It was all intertwined and constantly unstable. Hence the need for further stabilization, hence this dramatic civilizational effort. And political fragmentation was very important by that standard, because it reflected definitely that there were enough resources to do a lot of things, but the political and institutional structures still lacked and were dramatically developed at this point. Right? What we say as modern age fundamentally rests as an accomplishment of medieval civilization, because that the modern state is just building on a solid base that was concretized in medieval times. So a war, especially in these early, let's say between the 10th and the 12th, that then eventually starts being it was usually at short range. We have incredible things like what do you think that Godfrey of Bouillon knew about Palestine or Syria? Well, he led a freaking expedition from Belgium that managed to conquer them and to create states in there. So that proves how everything was feasible, even in a moment of alleged, complete anarchy or no. right? Is the history of the Crusades especially shows that there was a level of communicability, of organizability, etc., that is incredible for us. Why? Because when we look at these maps of medieval Europe, that are all that are also maybe somewhat too much styled on the 19th century pattern, but we still tend to look at them as nation states, right? In the 19th century Victorian geographical maps, kind of the idea of what humans have always been. No, it wasn't at all like that, but yes, they could organize major successful expeditions, very orderly ones, still without central states. This is something that I, personally as a medievalist, like for me, it's so obvious that I objectively realize that I forget to say it, but I did meet modernists or contemporaneous that literally believed that things couldn't function in the Middle Ages because there weren't central states. And no, they made it, and it's our modern mental problem not to be able anymore to understand how they made it and how well they made it, right? That's our limit. It's not their luck or chance or whatever. No, they made things, right? They made it, and this is obvious. I mean, think about the Carolingian Empire was essentially an early medieval accomplishment, right? So in a much less advanced Europe than the one of the 12th century. Well, they managed to conquer literally half of Europe there, right? If you evaluate that as by the 12th century everything was fragmented as a form of weakness, it doesn't even make sense. 12th century medieval civilization was dramatically more advanced than the one of 500 years before. And still they were fragmented. And this is not per se a negative thing, right? On the contrary, lots of very interesting things were happening in ever more advanced fashion compared to before. And there are major expeditions as well, as we were recalling. There are, the main problem between the 10th and the 12th centuries is that we don't have the same level of documentation of later centuries. From the 13th century starts becoming really cool, right? I would say the best century is the 13th, because if you have to study it, because there are enough sources, but not enough to overwhelm you. But already by the 14th century, there are too many sources, right? It's also obvious that the Middle Ages produced dramatically, but by far, an incredibly larger scale of sources, more than ancient civilization. Okay, many of those had been lost too, but don't think that the medieval civilization produced less, or that we know it less, or that it's let's say, more obscure in this regard. It is still true that sometimes we don't get exactly everything that we would like to know, especially from a military point of view. So that also the methods for studying medieval warfare are very different, right? For early Middle Ages, we studied a bit more as if it was like the ancient history, right? The sources are very similar. In fact, from the 12th, or from the 11th to 12th, we start having, but even some century before, from the 8th, 9th, we start having really a lot of interesting things more. It's just that even here we have to understand the context of every source, to be careful how to read it, of course, we should always know original languages first, but we can't also know everything, at least, if you want to study medieval history, at least Latin should be what you say. And no, it doesn't mean that, because even if you study countries that were not literate at the time and that wrote in Greek or in Arab, you still need to know Latin, because what we know through Latin sources is overwhelming also about those guys, especially about the illiterate ones. So no, there is no thing like you can avoid to know Latin, right? And translations are often, for medieval history also, they're not always there, because there is too much. It would be too much to translate. It's not like classical sources, and especially, you can't do yourself a favor in learning Latin just for, in obsequium to Western civilization, I would say. Surely however, the majority of military operations were on a smaller scale, right? The larger ones were, I would say, the ones brought together by major alliances, or entire countries, kingdoms, and with the Crusades also the entire Latin Christianity. But altogether considered that the logistical capabilities were limited a bit like to the ones of the ancient world, right? They weren't absolutely less. That's another thing that if you studied medieval warfare, marches, length, etc., you know that medieval armies in any period had the same identical daily speed of essentially 30 kilometers by average of any other army in, I don't know, like in the ancient world. The myth that these guys were less advanced, they had a less of a logistic, is completely false. If anything, it's the contrary is true, because medieval armies, especially with the rise of cavalry, were dramatically more in need of supplies for the horses, for that consume an astonishing amount of resources. They did easily more than even some other classical contexts. So no, this is not true. And armies, like at largest, could be 30,000 men, right? Just like in the ancient world, to command from the field specifically, right? Otherwise, more than that, it would be that was the golden average, I would say, at least of the maximum. You can still keep 50,000 men together, but basically I can't think of a medieval context what was a 50,000 man army for real, right? The sources often say a lot of things like hundreds of thousands of millions, but obviously those are exaggerations. But still, by medieval standards, to have 30,000 men on the field, it's something, and they did it, right? It happened. It was not frequent at all, especially in these centuries, but still. And they would have been if the political map of Europe had been more compact. That is, if larger countries had normally fought against each other, yes, it would have been normal, right? As we see it in Carolingian times. At that point, we see armies of that size. We see, there were major battles. Think about the Battle of Fontenoy in 841, or these things happen. You have, in order to evaluate that, you don't have to make strange logistical calculations. You have simply to ask yourself, to look at the political and social background and saying, was there any need to mobilize all those men, for which purpose, whatever. That's what answers your question, not the technology or this other, modernistic delusions. So, as we were saying, the feudal age, as we know it, coincided with the affirmation of the heavily equipped, heavily armed, and armored horsemen, right? Equipped with lance, sword, protected by the conical helmet, by the Husberg in iron mail. This was properly the elite, right? You have to think, I will never insist enough on this, but consider this, that the whole medieval feudal civilization was based on producing the resources for having that knight fighting on the field. We will have to make a video. How much did a knight cost? It costed the work of all the peasants that worked for the hours and hours and hours of labor to produce his arms and in armor, and sustaining his horses, his servants, to be an effective fighter on the field. But not only, of course, they needed fortifications, but how much for a crusader, but also for an average Christian knight, was needed, from socially speaking, from priests, to be educated, to pray, to indoctrinate them, to make them blindly believe in this. That was fundamentally the whole deal for what they felt. All this society fundamentally was universized, literally, and that universitas in medieval times was one of the most important words around, right? Because everything was turned to that thing, right? That knight embodied on the field an enormity of hours of work of the whole society, right? Of days and days and days and days of work. And that's why warfare also is very, meaningful to study, realizing what it meant to lose, for example, I don't know, hundreds of knights in a single battle, right? You could literally buy an entire kingdom like that. It happened, in fact, because you wouldn't have the resources properly to substitute them. Those were, in generations for that loss. And this is especially typical of the centuries that we discuss today. The surplus started existing since the 13th century, already changed a little bit the thing. There was a lot of monetization. The system started taking off along different patterns. But here, the crop rate is fundamentally the key. It's the it's the balance of everything, right? Even later on, because of course still pre-industrial societies are based on that, as we've seen. But here it's like exclusively, nearly exclusively. In the history of France of Richer de Rem, written at the end of the 10th century, we find what I think every medievalist military historian knows as an expression, milites peditesque, right? So it means literally the milites and the pedites as the knights and the infantry fundamentally, but it stresses by the union of these two terms. It doesn't say equites peditesque as a Roman would have written, right? It says milites peditesque. The miles, as you know, also properly in Rome, was the soldier meant because it really means he received the pay, right, from the millet, how they were paid properly in nature originally, the Roman legionnaires. Where here, milites embodies properly, is a synonym for equites, right? Miles and equus and singular respectively. Pedes singular, pedites plural. To stress the fact that the soldier par excellence is a mounted fighter. Right, this goes again, beyond any other consideration of on knighthood, on nobility. They are very tricky sometimes. Properly, when you read here, they are milites. You know paradigmatically that they are knights, right? Or at least they are mounted fighters specifically. It's easy to say knight, in fact, but also knights could be something very different. Also, the same etymology of knight is tricky if you want, right? Because it comes from knecht, that is servant. It's not the typical free noble that you imagine, more characteristically by, the 13th century. So we actually made videos on these differences, and we're not going to repeat them today. But there is a huge historiography on these topics that mostly makes you understand here the political and social differences of the various countries. Like, this is fascinating because if you pick, England, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, you see that at this point, knights fought all in the same freaking way. They used the same weapons, they had the same training, it was all identical, right? You can see, yeah, there are maybe a little, I don't know how to say that, folk shades, we say, the typical Iberian Jinnete type of trooper that is, however, not properly the heavier one, right? But maybe there's a little bit of bias towards that, but there are minor differences. Like the fact that the Germans were thought to have larger swords, or, but if you actually look at the whole picture, you confront all the historical archaeological sources, as these were virtually insignificant differences. Everybody was the same, right? And it would grow, like at the end of this period, like from Portugal to Poland, from Norway to Sicily, it was all freaking identical, right? Because it's this Frankish feudal culture that had made it, right? That had consolidated. And, but albeit they fought all in the same identical way, all of these countries had specific differences, right? In some countries, being a knight was a matter of nobility. In other countries, knights were servants, right? In some other countries, knights were not noblemen. You see that there are lots of variations, but the substance fundamentally remained the same proportionally. There would be an interesting consideration to make, as we were hinting at before, about combativity, right? That is to say, was there really a people that was like kind of had a higher military quality or something? Well, this is kind of a thorny topic for, because would lead to say, that people is more, naturally combative than no, that's racism. It's pseudo science, doesn't mean anything. Here it means about experience, how used they were to fight on a regular base, right? Which, as we've seen before, is not even, the index of a particularly better, background, right? But still, in terms of life quality, but still, yeah, there would be some differences of some kind, but there were also differences properly in the mindset, like on the motivations, right? For example, think about the military orders. Those were created with a degree of courageous fanatism that was unknown by average to the other knights, right? Orders like the Templars, the Hospitallers, were conceived like these people were born, or at least as properly as monks, because they were reborn in the moment in which they took vows, to be thrown. I mean, preferably not, because they were a very precious asset, because as we've seen, a knight costed a disproportionality in these wars, right? It was actually very proportioned to the needs, but still something incredible. But conceptually, they were designed, obviously, to fight in collective formations, and that's what makes any military quality, historically speaking, in any context. So, yes, these were individually also dramatically, trained. But still, properly, their mindset was to throw themselves into the midst of the enemy and, taking out 30 of them before being butchered down. That is, these people were designed properly to be wanting that, right? Of course, this is also kind of a romantic idea, but the level of what these people, what we overlook, in all history, is motivation, is moral forces, right? When you have a military elite that, as we've seen, fundamentally was all the same, technically speaking, what does that make the difference? Collective training, fundamentally, but properly motivation. So if you motivate these people, of course, to die in battle against the infidels to go to heaven, you create people that are literally suicidal sometimes, but that still make the job done, because maybe they charge into in such a hopeless way that the enemy wouldn't even believe it was possible, was overwhelmed, right? Like, the logics of warfare cannot be bypassed like that. This brought to them also to be exterminated on multiple occasions without any sensible tactical, strategical, benefit for the whole situation. But still, right, these people understood much better than us that what you have to invest in is moral forces, is brains, right? In the Middle Ages, where people, the literate ones, were able to even learn the Bible by heart. Think that those were the priests, the monks. Think about what a knight was required to, proportionally to what would be normally required to today, right? That kind of guts that it takes, that determination, that intelligence, etc., has nothing to do with what most people think warfare is about today, that is physically strong or courageous people. It has to do with a adamantine brain designed specifically to be rational, to have coup d'oeil, and determination in a proportion that most people today, doesn't matter how they look like thugs or they go to the gym, they would be completely they're complete slobs in comparison to, right? Always remember this, that doesn't matter what you think, you are radically, morally and physically inferior to these people individually. These were the elite of a world that did things that we don't even know how to replicate today. For example, technologically speaking, in spite we're dramatically more technologically advanced than them. Never think for an instant that you can simulate or reenact what these people did by any significant margin, that you can understand what they thought, or how they lived, or what moved them, because you can't. right? These are moral forces. They cannot be quantified. You don't know anything about that, and never make the childish mistake of considering yourself more intelligent or more capable than a person that lived 1,000 years ago, because you are not, and especially you never will, right? This speaking of individual capacities, all right? Because as we are saying, collective training is everything, right? The sap of the military art is that individuals are worthless, that only units count, right? So that you will be wiped out. Doesn't matter how strong or courageous you are. If you are strong, your body's nothing. Human body is ridiculous. It's one of the weakest, most fragile, and less consistent things that you can find on a battlefield. Courage is just for stupid people. Like if you're not rational, or you don't calibrate that courage with determination proper, that is to properly understand what it takes that you have to do and in which moment. Courageous people are stopped in front of the very first obstacle, because they can't contemplate how they're just throwing themselves into the meat grind, but they don't know how to survive, so they stop, obviously, for instinct of self-preservation. So the massive moral resources that are needed to be a medieval knight are something that we can't even dream of, right? Never think that we know how these people used swords or how they fought, because they would blow our freaking mind, right? Not in the way they would, as some people believed, making acrobacies or stunts that in the Middle Ages did in circus, like I don't know, shooting 5 arrows in 3 seconds. They literally did these things in circuses, not on battlefields, right? That's ridiculous. Here we're talking about what it takes to literally killing a people without blinking an eye, which is what nobody today normally has, and that just we do in military, let's say, for as a conditioned reflex, because normally humans are not designed to kill people, right? You have to stimulate that in either with a conditioned reflex or something, because normally humans tend not to do these things. These people were basically raised as military class at the time exclusively to kill people. And that's another thing that about our own military as well, we tend not to say no, because it's different now, it's civilized, it's more humane. The proceedings of war are not humane by definition, right? It's not even about career opportunities. Military serves to defend the country, and this is done exclusively by fighting when war is needed, and fighting is it gets down practically exclusively to kill the opponents, not to something else. Right, not to picking flowers. Well, these people had to live in a world, as we were saying, without state, full of mess of injustice, of corruption, etc. They had to literally butcher their way through it, and there was no other way to do it. You would not like to be these people. Psychiatric. What I always say is that it would be dramatically interesting to analyze a medieval knight. We know this. We know this from the sources. We know these people were kind of unique kind, like people that literally butchered even infants, did the worst kind of atrocities imaginable on a regular base by the foe. Right, by all these feudal ties that they were blind loyal to. It was their entire honor, respectability depended on how they did this without even questioning. And then when sung the stories of dames, etc., they broke down in tears like children, because they remembered their sisters, their mothers, what they were taken away from them. They were like 6, 7 years old, and we all know how few women lived, unfortunately. People already, like 1/3 of the people didn't reach adulthood, right? But women specifically were used exclusively to make children, and we all know how with infections, etc. They died as like flies, right? Okay, children especially, with women also, and maybe these women were all dead to them, but they remembered them, and they were still what it took eventually to be taken away from their home to become a medieval knight was a history of systematic psychophysical abuse at the limits of literally destroying the person and recreating a new one, So just imagine, because without that, they couldn't bear the moral and physical, the performance that were demanded in order to be effective military and for their own societies to work. Do you understand that? We were talking about knights, right? Not the average peasant / farmer that, frankly, wasn't that much, right? Don't think that, they were clever and smart in their own way, but militarily wise, we know how pre-industrial society's peasantry is. Like, it's something you don't even want to know even in there, right? It's a history of abuse, of incest, of violence, of something atrocious. We know this because, this was reality up to 200, 300 years ago. We are heavily documented on this. Even physically, they weren't that much at all. They lived terrible lives themselves, but the whole thing was functionalized for those time standards to make things work, and also it's thanks to the to the blood and tears of all these people for millennia that we can afford what we have today, right? Unfortunately, people don't give a shit, right? They just remain linked to their smartphones all the freaking time, doing nothing about their existence, right? When all this happened before them. So, as we were saying before, the equation miles equus, right, is reflected also by the lack of difference between ordo equestris and the ordo militaris, that is properly the. In fact, the equestrian military class was conceived as one, right? And equestrian military culture is fundamentally at the base of feudal warfare, as everybody knows. These are the centuries properly. Actually, the 10th to the 12th century are not even the full moment of predominion of cavalry on battlefields, right? Telling the truth, like the only century in which cavalry was properly uncontrasted on the battlefields was the 13th, maybe the second half of the 12th, right? Before, yes, it was still more important than cavalry, which started happening since the early medieval times, but still infantry could score victories, right? Instead, for roughly 150, 200 years, right, cavalry at some point was, we don't have news of that, we have news of infantry rising in parallel, because still this major political and social growth affected, the urban centers here. Feudalism developed, as we were saying before, in parallel also the city activities, etc., that produce better equipped infantrymen, right? So that is reflected by in fact, the countries that were more urbanized, that had communal governments, etc., produced the best infantry in Europe. It's kind of obvious. They had this sense of community, of municipality. That they were better armored because they were richer on average, right? So there is in parallel an improvement of both arms. Right, for not talking about crossbows, for example, other devices, etc., that increased altogether, cavalry efficiency. Think about the stirrup, right? That didn't make cavalry at all, and it quite gradually affirmed itself throughout these centuries as the foe. It's like together with the couché lance grip in the thickly packed formation for shock cavalry. It was not technology making it. It was politics and society making tactics that made certain technologies that would fundamentally improve those tactics minimally. But the existence of a military elite that would fight like that, would have the wealth, the amount of training for a lifetime continuously to carry out that lifestyle, was the reason why we arrived to that. Right. That's why the increase in effectiveness of shock charges required the stirrup, because you would otherwise, we know, certain knights would even tie themselves to the saddles, because at impact, which they did impact against, they would literally fly, over the catapulted from the horse. Think about the sheer amount of physical force. I don't know if you consider that cavalry charges normally were carried out 45 kilometers per hour. I don't know if if you have a motorcycle, if you drive, look at what it feels to go 45 kilometers per hour, and thinking not just to impact something at that point that is standing solidly against you, but specifically to impact another motorcycler that are that is just charging straight against you with a pointy stick at your face at 45 kilometers per hour, that is impacting at 90 kilometers per hour, right? And then we'll talk about what it takes, in terms of moral forces to be a medieval knight. It's frankly something that is better not to be known, I presume, for 21st century standard, because it's too devastating, like it's too traumatizing, I presume. So these guys, as properly as militas, as fighters, were not only specialists of combat, right? But they were, as we've seen, as such, the cornerstone of this of community. Indeed, behind the nobility, there was a properly a sense of aristocratic class, right? But this class was still opened in these centuries, right? It's only by the 13th century, 14th century that properly the nobility, as we intended in a categorical sense, like that family is unequivocally noble and they have that coat of arms and they're framed into the kingdom institution, etc., takes to place, right? It's like heraldry. Heraldry is more of a modern... It's actually a modern science. No, it didn't exist in the Middle Ages, right? There were all these symbols, identity that they believed in. There was still a pagan background to these symbolisms that they were literally felt to be the knight, right? As their coat of arms, the symbols there, they brought with them in battle. There's even in there a dramatically overlooked psychological character to it that goes beyond the physicality of things, which is also very political, in fact, because those symbols were somewhat where the honor these people resided. So showing up with them and behaving in a certain way on the field meant a lot, right? Even betraying was a matter of either it was a very strong political choice at that point, but all these people were extremely violent people. They competed with each other also much more than in the same way, especially in the early times, in exactly in the same way they would do with enemies. This is proven. Who is friend, who is enemy in the feudal world, by the way, given that political instability. This is reflected by tournaments. Early tournaments were not mock battles. They were literal battles like any other. Like they killed themselves in the same identical way, right? They mostly also kidnapped themselves, but the myth that it was a bloodless war because nobility just didn't kill each other it's a myth. It never existed. Nobles killed each other all the time. Right, kidnapping them was something, but still, it's not necessarily something you can do all the time, nor you may want to do all the time. There's not a unitary logic in that you can generalize on. But especially tournaments were something dramatically violent, and not even just among the fighters, but regularly also over the communities where these tournaments took place. That is to say, they chose a field to fight, and if in this field there were farms, people, they would lay everything waste. Right, just for fun, and you can imagine the degree of, we know it. Think about the pieces of God, the truces of God, all these efforts from the church, from public institutions to calm these people down, to all these cadet knights that didn't know what to do because they didn't inherit anything. They went as adventurers around, and they were nothing better than brigands, fundamentally, and how did they live? Right, they had to invent crusade by a certain standard, not entirely, right? It's just one of the motivations, but to get rid of them, because there was a scale of violence that by that time it's very difficult to imagine. Like it sounds banal, but it's interesting to think like that. There are no tanks, there are no machine guns, there are no helicopters. A pack of heavily armored knights that train for war since they're kids, for all their life, is factually the strongest force that existed on Earth. right? So, the average peasant here couldn't properly do much against that, right? So, it's a disparity of force that, of course, you can feel when, I don't know, many peasants are together. This happened, right? Peasants were not so passive at all. People believe that peasantry in the feudal era were the most, oppressed. Now that eventually the modern age arrived and people were freer. Absolutely not. Everybody knows from history that the Ancien Regime actually was formed by the 14th century, that modern peasants were dramatically less free than they were in the Middle Ages in the feudal era, right? And peasants were freaking dangerous, right? Not just because they were military, when they were angry, they did some of the most radically atrocious things in the annals of history, because peasants are, let's be honest, as you understand, I use the term class here and there just because I can't find another suitable synonym in English, but never buy the fact that since these people were objectively oppressed, they were actually better human beings than their oppressors. Of course, a medieval knight was a much more developed human and capable and intelligent human being than a peasant. And together with that, if you look at peasant violence during the Middle Ages, you see things that truly you don't want to know either, right? There is hardly any other social group like the masses, the exploited in terms of pure and senseless violence at every level. And when they and the other great myth, which I'm very attached to debunk, at least because I studied. I like knights more. Let's be honest. I like cavalry more, but I'm very attentive to infantries because my PhD was about them indirectly, and directly also about cavalry for that matter. It's that the myth that the cavalry, properly knights, didn't know about the infantry military potential. Right, there is this huge, ridiculous myth that basically we invented in the modern age to explain what, as idiots, we normally don't even have the time to do. That is, to study history, for example, and to see how, for example, still, during the 100 Years' War, the French kept using cavalry against the English for infantry, for example, even though they were defeated so many times. It's not because they were stupid or because they didn't give a damn about evidence, they were irrational. You're not, once again, more competent about medieval warfare than a French knight of the 14th century, right? There was nobody in the world as aware than a knight of what the potential of infantry was. Not even infantry, right? Because, surprise, surprise, knights fought always alongside infantry, right? And they used them for their own purpose, and there was no medieval army where infantry did not exist. So the question, especially in these contexts, so knights always knew what an angry mob could turn like, right? And never think that there is something mechanic that you understand better than these people, or because that's already a mistake by definition. What you don't see is the moral of it. It's not what weapons you have in your hand when you want to kill somebody, but the fact that how much you want to kill that somebody that makes the difference. This is war, not technical stuff. It's will, right? And this explains a lot about, in fact, the various military developments at the time too. Not that the material dimension doesn't help, right? But it's not of primary importance in the world picture. It doesn't. It just takes to study battles from the sources. Nobody cared about weapons. Sources do not talk about them. It's not important, right? Unless it's something, innovative or, in a particular battle as a detail, but you will never find like an account says, these guys won because they had those weapons. No. It's evidently because they were angry and they wanted to kill the hell out of those other guys, and incidentally they had also suitable weapons to do it, but they would have done it even here. Weapons were dramatically homogeneous everywhere, right? Knights, by the way, could use every kind of weapon themselves. They would also dismount, especially in this time. That was very common for militaries actually to dismount and fight on foot as well. So Sometimes infantry was literally them. But here I'm digressing. These are things that I've explained elsewhere. I'm not going to repeat now. But initially, the military class was quite inclusive because there were opportunities, and this thing would arrive. The lock of the military order would arrive by with the 14th century crisis, right? Whereas before, lots of people also, independently from birth and their fortunes, could join in and demonstrate their combat aptitudes, right? All it took was to know how to fight, which naturally was becoming ever more specialistic in nature, like professional, let's say, better in nature. But let's say if you had, I don't know, killed somebody and stole his equipment and his horse, and you maybe knew already how to go on horseback, and more or less you had trained with other weapons and things like that, you could join other fighters acquiring that practice, and yeah, why not joining in the in the fray and acquiring skill and making fortune? It's full of these stories, frankly, and also, we're talking about peoples that maybe came from other, not properly other social background, but maybe even from other countries that maybe were not feudalized in nature. Think about the late Viking era. It's plenty of these guys that absolutely know how to go on horseback themselves. It's just they don't have the same degree of collective training and habit to equestrian military culture than to, I don't know, a Frankish knight, but they're still pretty damn good as warriors, and they're very versatile, etc. Speaking on average always, right? So of course it's a myth that Scandinavians didn't have much of a strong cavalry. Yeah, they had less than the others, as we've seen, but still they had, right? And it's it was something deeply imbued even in pre-Viking era Scandinavian culture, that the hero would be a horseman, right? It's just that collective, that there weren't so many as in the continent, so also there was not so much wealth to just sustain the many horses together, the logistical things as the state built. Okay, so that made that cavalry less effective collectively, but still, right? So in this moment, differences are still quite blurred. So many people would join and fit in. For many people from many places in Europe, by the way, we know there were people, literally Western knights at this point could be found literally everywhere, right? North Africa, the Caspian Sea, Middle East. They were selling their services every freaking where, and also there were lots of other peoples locally that would do the same. Right? It's just that these guys, as we've seen, were booming as a system at home. Yet it's true, as we were saying before, that gradually and systematically the inferior strata of society were excluded from the military function proper. As we've seen, this doesn't mean that they couldn't be military effective as other, especially as infantry, right? But their level of professionalism would make them sink morally and materially in the following centuries before the re-eruption of the 14th century, the early 14th century. Then for just 50 years, then they went down again, actually. But in front of cavalry on the field, right? They were used as auxiliaries fundamentally. They were actually very useful, or even indispensable, especially in sieges, famously enough, but depreciated, right? Always remember that knights, this military class was developing with a sense of themselves, was still quite archaically primitive and brutal in, moral standards that were fundamentally still based on the idea that there were, almost quasi-racially superior individuals, right? The idea of nobility of blood, right? Knights believed that were fundamentally superior beings to peasants. Peasants were seen renowningly also by, but the nobility to core, even in cities, as barely human beings. Like, they were often considered as almost as animals, as if they had something that were properly that made them racially different from the others. It's quite disturbing, but it is the truth, because for this military class, it was much more important, even internationally, to regard themselves as such, right, as a community, as with our own identity, than the whole rest of society that had a terrible sense of superiority that was also necessary to for that kind of lifestyle, that tactical aggressiveness and combat readiness in every kind of situation that would make them factually superior, in fact, to these other people. So it's obvious that consider that Europe, like most of the world at that time, came from a moral background where literally the idea was that the strongest had the right to rule. So these people were still barely as if they were ancient tribesmen in a sense, right? Morals hadn't changed that much, right? Christianity was just starting to mediate, to kind of functionalize in a more orderly and intelligent fashion, but for these people, being superior in arms to somebody would meant that they basically won the right to make these people their slaves, and this is absolutely a thing that we have to remember. Otherwise, you can't properly even understand how meaningful it was the rise of infantry again in the following centuries, because it took a dramatic moral force. It's not easy to emancipate yourself from an oppression from a psychological point of view. These are very important topics. So, as such, the peasant mass, right, was since that point marked as imbelle or inerme vulgus, that is to say, unwarlike, right, or properly weak, incapable to defend, right. The vulgus is the people, fundamentally, counterposed to the elite of the pugnatores, so properly those who fought as a naturally, it's an idea, right? It's mostly, like for most things feudal, it's a bit the elitistic ideological product of not even necessarily of the nobility proper. Sometimes these view of a fixed order with the fighters, the prayers, then and the workers was actually an ecclesiastical picture. We know, in fact, that knights, fighters were actually much more aware, as we've seen, of their own and other people's capabilities, and also much less preoccupied with this sense of fairness that chivalry has, was wanted to literally boast to, to regulate a bit the behavior mostly from a political point of view. And it's said, as we were saying before, that these times are not so well documented, so that we can't often see behind chronicles pages what reality was actually like, especially from a voice of these of knights that were regularly literate, fundamentally, at least most of the times, especially in this period. It's difficult to talk as a whole of what the role of knights was in this picture without digressing. But it is true that outside of the military class, other communities that were mostly rural didn't have many means to defend themselves. Otherwise, they would mostly entrench themselves within some walls, maybe the ones of seigneurial in seigneurial possession. So the same guys that actually were knights and they had their retinues of thugs, of that worked as professional militarymen, and so. Yeah, there was this is typical of many times in history, that the seigneury is not formed just with violence, but simply for convenience, right? These people already knew they wouldn't have the means to protect themselves, so they said it's better if I pay something, even in my own personal freedom or whatever, than actually, ending up butchered by somebody, right? And in fact, even many serfs sometimes had better lifestyle and career than namely freemen, because they were under somebody's protection. They would even become noblemen themselves, because maybe they were entrusted as administrator to control some castle, and maybe their lord died, and or they remain in service for many generations, their children, etc., they would acquire a higher status compared to the rest. And we could talk also about encapsulation, the role of fortifications. We shall make a video about that specifically, but you know that fundamentally these structures had a great importance in medieval warfare, because factually there weren't many means properly to invest in order to storm, even some modest ones, considering not the technology of the time, because as soon as they had the means, they invented things to get past this. Properly the resources, right? What do you need? Complex, torsion catapult system to storm a moat, right? Nobody would invest in that, right? It's too costly. You just surround the moat, you raid around, and you hope to take those guys by starving them. But if you don't have enough resources to stay there long enough, you'll simply go away. That's why it was so effective, right? And still, instability always provided new opportunities, right? It was much easier to get castles by treachery than by storming. And there were effectively more chances to do it, right? So also less bloody ones actually than recurring to the assaults of things like that. Otherwise, still sieges were quite common as well, right? I wouldn't even say they were the most. Most people say, warfare was at the time was mostly about sieges. Well, not really. Because around the siege, there was still a lot of minor operations that were still about fights in the open, etc. So those are the really overlooked clashes, like the smaller ones that sometimes were not even recorded, right? Whereas the siege by itself was already a big deal because somebody finally decided to invest that much. Right, and that's also what normally, in fact, would bring to pitched battles, because in the Middle Ages it's paradigmatic. Basically, all pitched battles were fought for, essentially preventing somebody for storming a castle. And that's why major armies would gather to clash against one another. Otherwise, there wasn't even that great strategical need to do it. So everything must be contextualized, but we're going by approximation here. Consider another factor is that we're seeing an economy in this whole idea. Well, money was rare, right? The payment means were limited and discontinuous. Just the governors and powerful people had some cash proper, but natural goods were the preferred reward. Also think about how looting constituted in the broader economy of war. As such, the ultimate aim was essentially seizing a place to leave off the to actually leave of rent of these of the local peasant communities' work, right? And that's how knights were properly maintained in life. And so the granting of land, that is the base of feudal political practice, is born exactly for this reason. It's actually very common in many other realities by some degree, but here it's really imbued, it's ingrained in at an almost complete level as a form of service and reward. In fact, in practice, it was also an hereditary concession, as you know, in exchange for the performance of a certain amount of military service. The initial concept was that the king owned all the land, so technically a guy was given just for a while this land. But factually, given that kings were not that capable to control directly all territory, given that they didn't have a centralized power and therefore they didn't have their own troops that could crush everybody else's, this way of giving land was just to say, okay, I as a king with this our legitimization, some power on my own and some, sacralization, political, let's say, prestige, I give you this land, and therefore you maintain this tie with me, and, it may be convenient for you to remain like that, but these people fundamentally would entrench literally themselves in there, would start building their own fortresses, they would start, maintaining the control in in an ever more properly territorialized way. As we've seen, it was also a matter of becoming de facto independent in certain cases. And the recruitment of paid fighters existed as well, right? However, it remained a secondary fact, marginal one. In any case, less important of the maintenance of garrisons at the expense of the wealthy, of the powerful, of the lords, fundamentally. Because a big deal of the problem was also maintaining all these territories with some individuals, like with somebody that literally was loyal enough, garrisoned those places, and that's where the great form of centralization, the greater form of centralization passed through. In a sense, that is, we've seen also the ministeriales, other figures of servants, right, and not of freemen. Knights were usually freemen, so they could inherit, etc. Instead, there was a privileged kind of way for using lesser individuals to say that they couldn't inherit. It would have not been recognized around by others as freemen, as part of the military class, right? It could be used for this, right? That therefore had their own interest to be protected by the king, to be loyal to him, right? And that's a bit how it worked. And but they had to be maintained too. They had to be provided wealth, otherwise, they would have gotten the land otherwise, and they would become, as it did happen, I was saying before, also autonomous lords on their own. So it was all blurred along this pattern, in a sense. The church was surely influencing the war activity and mentality. Surely it prescribed or proposed a new ideal of Christian soldier, right? Making the effort to exalt some military virtues where, especially the effort was directed against the infidels, right, to moderate or sublimate them, when said was about internal strifes, because naturally this was actually the primary concern of an average knight, fighting wherever he, religion was not that great divide after all. It was full of Christian knights that fought for Muslims. They didn't have much of a problem with that. The problem was rather, where the major interest was, most of the times, also to settle down more stably, more safely within a Christian society. And a legitimate one, so that the church could say, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, right? Think about excommunications, crusades also against heretics, things like these. These were important means of stabilization. Actually, the church played, even here, contrarily to the anti-modernistic, mostly anti-clerical prejudice stereotype, that the church was fueling violence. Actually, this is not true. Church was actually working mostly for depacification of Christian society, directing the military efforts towards the external, so to expand Christianity, not differently from what fundamentally any other religion did, right? Paganism was about solely about a military religious principle. Other religion, there is not a difference here. Christianity was just doing it in a better organized and more effective unitary way, thanks to the development of the papal monarchy, and this would bring mostly to the stabilization of Europe. If you look at, it's not that the church didn't interfere for its own interest in this regard, but this interest mostly passed through pacification. That is to say, there was a war among two Christians. They said, okay, one of the two had to cut it, right? And if he wouldn't, which excommunication was already a big deal, by the way, because that would cause further instability in its own domains, whatever. So mostly nobody cared about protracting the war, right? And therefore adjusting the situation. And even in here, there was nothing so categorical at the end of the day, because, as we said before, everything was so fragile as a balance that, these interference was mostly also to have a political recognition. And even if the church fought bitterly against, especially its own prerogatives, to maintain properly a territorial power of its own, it's fair to say that during medieval history, church operated for properly pacification of Christian society, which actually happened, right? Europe became more stable, the more, Christianized, but not because of religion in itself, just of religion, let's say, but because this went in parallel all with those forms of, political and territorial control that the church had sponsored and also had derived its power, its own power, right? And in the process, Europe prospered, right? So if it had been such a devastating thing, things would have not taken that macroscopic direction in the history of mankind. So in this picture that is very general, that we have tried to outline, Western Europe in its complex had some differences that will have to justify a separated analysis of the great areas of which it was composed, right? Which we will do on another occasion, right? So we'll I make these videos in a pretty scattered fashion, so that I go pretty random, but we'll cover them. We never did. As far as I choose topics, I could have already started with one of these areas and then making the introduction. It's totally random, but we will definitely, I hope I will have the time, the possibility to do it. And for now, therefore, I stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.